Okay, Mr. Costa, firstly, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your time. And as you know, that today we will talk about the U.S.-China trade negotiation in Washington, as it's expected. So, and actually, my first question is about the last recent negotiation in Beijing between these two superpowers. Firstly, I would like to know what's your impression from the last meeting between these two countries in Beijing, and what we can expect from the upcoming meeting in Washington, how this meeting will affect on the stock market in the world.
Sure. Thanks for having me. First, we don't think there will be any material deal to be reached in the following days. There's really kind of two possibilities here in my view. One being sort of a relatively small deal on the U.S. being able to export more of its energy and agricultural commodities to China, but that would be relatively small. The second one would be some sort of short-lived Plaza Accord version that would kind of drive the yuan higher against the dollar. But we think that would all be unsustainable due to the credit imbalances that we see in China. We think China just hit a great wall of debt. And our work shows that China is really in a recession right now, with the median stock price in China down over 1/3 of its market value from its peak. And as we continue to see some sort of more monetary and fiscal profligacy going forward, that should really hurt the yuan, and a depeg of the yuan seems almost inevitable. Now, market-wise here in the U.S., I think we're in a very similar setup that we had in November. The very end of November 2018, we kind of had a record optimism in the markets that we would reach a deal in the G20 meeting in Argentina, and that ended up being sort of a negative surprise for the markets, and kind of triggered a sell-off that we had in December. We think we're in a very similar position today, and you can see that by looking at just the volatility, the implied volatility in equity markets. The implied volatility in equity markets actually are not pricing in any possibility for negative news in the next months or weeks, and we think that's not necessarily correct. And maybe there is an opportunity to in a perfect setup, if we're really about to start what we think it's going to be the second leg of a bear market here in the equity markets in the U.S.
Mr. Costa, actually, if you compare Trump administration's previous reaction to China's policy, and if you compare it to current policy, we can see some compromise in Trump's step towards China. What stands behind this compromise from the Trump side? Because as we saw that Trump always imposed some tough reaction against China. Because of mostly it was related to the intellectual property. So what made Trump to take a step back in connection with China?
Sure. I think there could be some compromise from both parties first, but I don't think they would reach any significant deal. I think what made Trump change his policy was the recent market volatility we had in the last quarter of 2018, which I think it's likely to continue regardless of any sort of bullish trade deal statement that it's kind of how we're seeing markets reacting in the last years. We believe the U.S. is at the very end of a business cycle as well. Stocks historically overvalued, kind of overdue for a downturn. And we think that, market really peaked in September of 2018. And as we enter this sort of second leg of the bear market, and the credit cycle turns, liquidity dries out, everyone wants to be a seller. I think Trump has some sort of sense of urgency to reach a deal to prop up the equity markets, but wouldn't be anything material in our view.
Yeah, actually, you said that mostly volatility affected Trump's behavior to change. Actually, affected Trump to change his behavior toward China, and also we know that there are some crucial clash points between these two countries which can't be compromised by any side. First, for example, we talked about intellectual property. Are there any other sectors that Trump administration and also Beijing, official Beijing, will not compromise each other? And how you can see the future of this negotiation from this perspective?
Sure, I think there's a much bigger force that make it really difficult for both parties to reach a deal. And I guess it will depend on the stock market reaction in the next days if we're going to see some sort of delayed on more of this trade war. But what we think it's happening is sort of a Cold War kind of developing between the U.S. and China, and we think that we reached some sort of peak globalism, and now we're in an upsurge protectionism among those countries, and mostly due to any trade deals that will actually mean that China will be shrinking their balance sheet, their trade balance. It can't be positive for an economy that is running or relying on a very indebted growth model to at the same time be able to run a trade deficit. So if you look at China all the way back to the global financial crisis in December of 2008, China lost close to 8 or 9 percentage points of current account relative to its GDP. And it's actually the only economy in the world that was able to manage having such a shrinkage of its current account balance and still experience a rise in its currency relative to the dollar. We think that's just part of the imbalance, and things are more likely to unfold in a way that yuan is likely to devalue going forward.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned that it costed, actually, this trade war costed to China, actually, the loss of 9% of its annual GDP. So, and actually, Trump, it was also somehow affected to the U.S. that there are some budget deficit in the U.S. In the U.S. budget. So, we'd like to ask question, as we know that recently Trump somehow expressed his willingness that he wants to delay, to postpone, and to extend the deadline, which will actually end on March. And we would like to talk about this. If, for example, actually Trump wants to extend it up to 60 days, what will change during this 60 days? Do you really believe that Xi administration will change its policy during this 60 days? If not, what's the logic behind this delay, this postpone, and how and why the U.S. government wants why U.S. government need these 60 days? What will change in these days if we take into account that both sides sharply, they actually don't take step back?
Sure, I think not much could change at least on the trade negotiation side of things. It's possible that both parties would try to reach a deal that would be no material really. But going forward, what really matters here is that China has a credit imbalance that is really kind of unfolding on a crisis on its own. We think that if you look back in history, what's happening with China, you can study credit bubbles for the last 30 years, and what we see is that you can see some sort of a crisis unfolding in ways in which you have kind of an inflationary bust. In other words, the currency devalues, but the stock market in local currency terms actually rises. Or you can have another kind of scenario in which you have the decline in currency and also the decline in equity markets. Now, in China, the one pattern that we saw across all these credit bubbles that we studied in the past was that gold prices in local currency terms tends to rise. So we think that this, one person that really wants to understand China has to be monitoring, gold in yuan terms. And gold in yuan terms is telling a very different position than what we had back in 2016 in a sort of, soft landing scenario with the Fed pausing rate hikes and so forth. What we're seeing today is actually gold prices in yuan terms rising significantly, breaking out from a 3-year resistance line and now being in its upper channel in a lower bound of upward channel. We think that that's perhaps the macro trade of the year, and it's likely to continue to develop regardless of any trade negotiation, especially because, like I said, if any trade negotiation will mean that China will actually have to shrink their trade balance. That can't be positive for China in any way, especially by the way they're designed to grow by taking more debt to generate less growth, over time.
Yeah, actually, if you take into account that when the negotiation process started between these two countries, as you said, actually, that the stock market somehow end its volatility and the prices started going up. So and after this issue, we said that Federal Reserve System, the president of the Federal Reserve System, announced that it's not willing to increase or to make some changes on interest rates. So, what's the expectation for the future as the China and as the negotiation process is on the way? So, do you really think that it's crucially important for Federal Reserve System to change interest rates?
Sure, I think that's a very important topic. The change in the Federal Reserve stance is really an acknowledgement that there is something wrong with the economy here in the U.S. and globally. If you look, one way to look at this is just look at the credit markets and see how they're reacting and how they're pricing in any sort of reaction of the Federal Reserve. And you can see that, the 5-year yield is now actually inverted versus the Fed funds rate. And the 3-year yield is also inverted versus the Fed funds rate. That tells you that the forward market is not really pricing in the possibility of further rate hikes. And actually, we're starting to see some possibilities of rate cuts in forward markets. And when you start to have that, the spread only goes negative of those yields when you're at the peak of the cycle. We had some sort of similar situation in 2006, and then we had it again in the tech bubble in 2000, and we're having it today. A lot of people, what we see is some sort of optimism towards the equity markets just because the Federal Reserve is going to be pausing its interest rate cycle. Now, it's a very different scenario than 2016. In 2016, the other way to look at it is just look at the percentage of yield curve that is inverted in the U.S. And the way we look at it is just looking at the 30-year yields all the way back to the overnight rates and comparing all those spreads. And we see somewhere close to almost 40% of the curve is inverted in the U.S. And that was not the case in 2016. The percentage of inversions in the yield curve today in the U.S. is just as high as it was, back in the housing bust and again in the tech bust in 2000. So we think this is really means we're at the end of a business cycle. We have a very high conviction that the other way you can think about some of our positions is that we really like gold relative to S&P 500 ratio. That is likely to rise. So gold relative to U1 and gold relative to S&P 500 ratio is perhaps one of the best trades, macro trades we can find and today. If you look at that chart, just gold relative to S&P 500, it's just, it broke out from a multi-year resistance line and it broke out with authority back in December and now kind of retested the same breakout line. We think that as we started to kind of move upward again on that ratio, we're going to see equity volatility picking up at the same time in a very similar manner that we had in 2006 and 2007, and then kind of diving into the whole bear market situation. So we think that we're overdue for a bear market in the U.S., and the bear market really started in September. We had the first lag in December. It was one of the worst Decembers in history, all the way back to 1930s. And then we have this kind of what we think it's a bear market rally, and now it's setting up perfectly to the second leg of a bear market here in the U.S.
Actually, do you have some assumption that when it's expected for the Federal Reserve System would increase the interest rate in the U.S. market, in the U.S.?
No, I don't. I don't think that they can do that if the credit markets are telling them to essentially not to do so. And historically, they really follow credit markets. So I suggest people to really watch that. I mean, it's just look at the 5-year and the 3-year yields, and when they convert against the Fed funds rate. I mean, that really is. Is the credit markets really telling you that there won't be any Federal Reserve rate hikes anymore, and historically the Federal Reserve can't really go against the credit markets in that sense. That's because it would spook the markets and perhaps really cause more turmoil and volatility. So we think it's more likely actually to see a reversal on the path, and when we see a reversal, it tends to happen as you get into a bear market. You can see back in the housing bubble when we got into this downturn sort of pattern in the equity market here in the S&P 500. That was actually precisely when the Fed had to kind of cut interest rates and get into a rate cut cycle again. And we think that that's actually more possible than a rate hikes increase in the following in a rate hike in the following months. So yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Costa, thank you so much for your time. It was our last question. We are very grateful to you for your comprehensive comments on our question. We really appreciate your time, and thank you that you joined us today. It was nice to talk to you, and I hope we will keep in touch for the future interviews. Have a nice day.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Goodbye.